filming today for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive. It's a great pleasure to have with us John LaPorta, who has a resume that goes on, and I would read it except we only have an hour, so we'll have to see if we can kind of focus in on a few of the many things you've done. And you obviously are a clarinet player and a fine alto saxophonist.
I don't play alto anymore. I did for 20 years.
Yes.
I changed to, I was originally tenor saxophone player, and I changed to help a band out and wound up playing it for 20 years.
Right.
And then when I went to Berklee, I wound up playing in the saxophone quartet there with Joe Viola, and played tenor, and I didn't want to play both. I had Jimmy Dorsey's old horn.
Did you really?
For years, yeah.
Yeah.
And I sold it about 20 years ago to a dear friend of mine that used it as a spare.
Well, you recorded a number of things on alto as well.
Well, that was in the time I was playing alto.
Yeah. Well, you have been in both worlds, the performing jazz world and the jazz education. In fact, you and Stan Kenton kind of, and a couple other people really were on the ground floor of jazz education.
Well, you're speaking about the summer jazz camps. Yeah.
Yes.
Stan Kenton was the head of it. It was really thought of and ran by Ken Morris.
Mm-hmm.
But Stan Kenton was the head of the camp then. They were wonderful camps. They were really a beginning. Ken Morris was a ballroom operator, and he talked to Buddy Morrow and asked him, he said, you know, I see this disappearing, and I'm making money off rock groups now, and I'd like to see what I could do with it. He says, why don't you start a summer camp for high school students, you know. I thought that was a good idea and got started with it, and we had upwards of 250 students per camp. They usually ran about a week apiece, and had as many as 4, 5, 6 summer camps in different locations at colleges or universities, campuses.
When you grew up, you were into classical technique.
Well,
You started as a classical player.
I studied with Joseph Gigliotti in Philadelphia, and his son has been for quite a few years the first clarinetist with the Philadelphia Orchestra.
Yeah. Did you have aspirations as a classical clarinetist?
Well, I did then, and I got more and more involved with the jazz end of it, and it just seemed just too difficult for me to try to keep up both things, especially at that time.
Right.
Because Whitmore Marcellus made a liar out of me. Because he's done beautifully at both of them. I did record the Brahms Sonata for clarinet. That was quite a few years ago. I was under exclusive contract with Fantasy, and I thought one of my projects each year would be to do a serious work. By serious, I mean classical work. And then do something on the other side that was comparable to it as a jazz venue. And the first effort that I did was a Brahms Sonata in F. And on the other side I had like a Betty Goodman type trio. And it's a wonderful album, but it bombed. The classical critics then wouldn't handle it, and the jazz critics then couldn't. So. But there was something prophetic in the liner notes that Nat Hentoff wrote. He wrote that, he says, this is the kind of album that in 1984 would probably reach an audience. 1984 was the year that Wynton Marsalis got a double Grammy. Isn't that wild?
And you recorded this when?
Oh, 1957.
Yeah. I guess people couldn't handle both.
That was prophetic. I couldn't get over that.
Amazing. But you started with Woody Herman at a pretty young age. Is that right?
Well, I was 24.
Okay.
But I had already been on the road with Bob Chester for about 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Playing tenor?
Playing alto.
Oh, playing alto at that time. Yeah.
There was a band in Philadelphia by the name of Buddy Williams that he got stuck for lead alto, and he asked me about it. I said, well, I'll take a crack at it, and that's when I got the Jimmy Dorsey alto cigar cutter.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful instrument, and started playing lead alto for him, and then kept it up for 20 years.
Mm-hmm. What kind of events, were they dances mostly that you played for when you were on the road with that kind of thing?
Well, they varied. We played it with Buddy Williams. We played, and Bill Harris was in the band then, and Irv Kluger, I don't know whether you know that name. He was quite a well-known drummer. We played in Dayton at a place called Lance's Merry-Go-Round Bar. And WLW used to be a famous radio station that had national coverage. It had the largest range of any radio station then. They used to have nightly broadcasts for it, so it was a very good place for a band to play. So we played there for 2 months on different occasions, and then the band broke up. A lot of the people went into the service, Second World War. And then some of the people started getting into some of the more well-known national bands like Bob Chester and some of them went, Bill and 3 of the trombone players went with Bob Chester and then went with Benny Goodman.
At this, what time, what year was this around?
41, 42.
So at this time, we sometimes have a hard time getting the picture that jazz was really the popular music of the day, or swing-oriented.
Well, my feeling about that is that essentially the music was all in danceable tempos. You know, the swing and the sweet bands and everything else, they were all playing pretty much the same kinds of tempos, so people could relate to them and dance to them. As jazz started to become more of an art form, it got into, by the very process of evolution, got into doing different kinds of things, getting into different kinds of time signatures and variations and things like that. And then the music got more complex too, so there became a division there. That's probably an oversimplification. I'm sure it's more complex than that.
Yeah, but when it got into the bop period, for instance, it became a lot of times much quicker tempos and
I think
not as
there
danceable.
was economic considerations that went on. There were, for a long time, there weren't records. People had to go. Sometimes they drove 100, 150 miles to go see a band, you know, so this had a lot to do with the live aspect of performance in that time. But when Woody's band broke up in late '46, the records were becoming quite commonplace. The bands were becoming very expensive to field. The economy was not good then. There was a whole combination of elements. Woody's band was doing very well. He broke up for other reasons. He had family problems, and he had to get back and mend some fences. But found that after a year he couldn't tolerate nothing with the band and went back again. But at that point, 4 or 5 bands broke up. You know, the Dorsey Brothers and quite a few of the bands broke up. It was really the end of an era.
Right.
You know? And television had a great deal to do with it, so there was a whole bunch of factors. I mean, as I see it, that came into play then.
Yeah, it's interesting because musicians today complain about the same kinds of things almost. They say that the DJs take over some of the work these days. So I guess some things don't change. It's just the different circumstances. You know, at that time it was the economy. Nowadays it's technology, and it's different things that affect the music, but somehow it goes on.
The times change. People don't. You know, the characteristics that people have don't. You know, the competitiveness and the things that go into play for things to happen. But music answers different needs at different times, you know. I know a lot of the older musicians feel like, well, you know, the music now is not any good for, you know, of course most of those people, and I'm probably a product of that too, go down memory lane. You know, they associate the music that was part of their roots and they're part of their beginnings. So the young people have their own voice, you know, in terms of what seems to satisfy them. And the music that is produced is created for the things that seem to be happening with the younger people.
Was there a noticeable difference at the time between let's say the bands like Glenn Miller and the white-oriented bands and Basie and Ellington that you can talk about?
Well, there certainly was. A good example would be Dixieland music. I never realized until I made a study, I wanted to do a New Orleans concert at the school after being there for 25 years and never having seen one at Berklee. Because it was a modern school, you know, for that time. I decided to do a New Orleans concert, and the students really loved it because it was so different from what they heard there. But in the process of, you know, preparing for it, I got to realize that the thing about feeling music in 4/4 rather than 2/4, you know what I mean by that, was not something, a product of our time, but existed from the very beginning. You go back to Jelly Roll Morton and the New Orleans music, a lot of it feels, the black music feels in 4/4. The white influences are in 2. Mingus one time, the only time I ever had, Charles Mingus, the only time I ever had an argument with him was that he was not happy about a drummer he used because I had used him on a record day, and then he didn't like him on the thing. And finally he screamed at me, he says, "Don't you realize he goes to the wrong church?" You know. So you know, if you go into Middle America and you listen to country music or whatever, you'll find that the concentration of accents rhythmically are on 1 and 3.
Yes.
And if you go into a black church, the concentration of accents are on 2 and 4. And this is what he was referring to. I broke up, and that was the end of the argument. So I think that's the basic difference that there was. And then the blues nature, you know, I think born sociologically from the pain that they had gone through and everything else, are very evident qualities, you know. Of course, I had problems playing with white groups because my influences were black when I was young. When I first started hearing records around the age of 16, 17, I got into Lester Young and Duke and you know, their music. Whenever I went to a white session and sat in, of course they were playing Dixieland music, and then accused me of playing wrong notes and everything else. It was what I heard. And then I'd play in a black session, and nobody seemed to be bugged about the so-called wrong notes I was playing. See? So I felt like I was at home, you know. So I've always had that kind of sort of contradiction going on in my life.
Well, it served you pretty well. I was interested in, you brought up Charles Mingus, and I know you did some significant work with him. In fact, we have this
Oh, yeah.
CD there.
Yeah,
And you got along pretty well with him then.
yes, that was the only time we ever had
Yeah.
a rub. But getting along with Mingus well can be a problem too, because he was the kind of person who was always looking for your Achilles heel. And I didn't like being thought of in that way. I just wanted to make music together. But I loved playing with him. I felt like he took the handcuffs off and made me free to play. Because a lot of rhythm players didn't care about playing with him because his approach was quite different. He was playing less like just a timekeeper, just the basis function is just to play the quarter notes, and keep steady time. And he played more where he moved the time around, and the rhythm sections are much more fluid today. And
Right.
he was one of the influences toward that end.
Yeah, he was in on it early.
Yeah.
It must have been hard to play with that unless you really could free up, I guess.
Well, drummers didn't like, especially the older drummers didn't like that, because they came from a different school and they felt most comfortable. People have a tendency to build their own yards, and they don't want to exclude anything that happens after their time, and a sort of rigor mortis that's in,
How did the Jazz Composers Orchestra come about?
Bill Koss, I don't know whether you know that name or not, was editor for Metronome magazine. Metronome magazine is now defunct, but it was the parallel of Downbeat during those years. Was a very good friend of Mingus, and they talked about it, and Bill kind of organized it. And what the idea of it was that it was to be player-writer members. And this is what it was essentially. And we were together for about 2.5 years. We put together 3 major concerts, and they were well received by the musicians in New York City. And the only thing that exists today are a few articles, that were write-ups on the concerts. We were supposed to do a recording of a live concert with, I think it was with Savoy, and the New York Union got wind of it, and they insisted upon getting money for the whole concert in front. And since it was still monaural, the chances were good that nothing would come out of the taping of the concerts. So it was just prohibitive in terms of the cost of it. So it was never recorded, which is a shame.
Thanks for the union.
About a month later, that was the last concert we did, and it was just too much for me. I was the musical director of it, and just kind of controlling all these various human elements was just beyond me. I'd had enough of it, so I said, look, somebody else can handle this. I'll just play in it, and it just kind of fell apart. But a month later, Mingus called me up. He said, would you like to do a date? I said, sure. I went there, and the nucleus of the composer's workshop was there, and that's the way Mingus's jazz workshop records came into play.
Yeah.
I'm glad that he did it, because otherwise there would be no record of it.
And you, along the way, picked up some degrees from, was it Manhattan School of Music?
Yeah, I went to Manhattan School of Music.
Did they have a jazz
I think it was, at that point, many musicians were starting to feel, because of the changes that had taken place in the business, that they wanted to get into the education sort of it. So there were many well-known musicians going to school right around the same time. I only taught as a substitute 4 days in high school, but afterward.
And you survived.
But I'm glad I went through it. Yeah.
But then you ended up right at Berklee, and
Well, I taught privately,
uh-huh.
and in New York City for 10 years or so. And I really wanted to make a move. I thought my musical life was starting to diminish there. I had a family and I was busy raising them, and it seemed like everything I was doing took more and more energy to do, and I wanted to get into a different area. So I had started, I think the summer camps had been going on for about 2 years, and I decided to sound around about getting into some kind of college teaching, and I met Bob Scher then, who was the provost for Berklee School of Music then, and talked to him about it, and he was the first one I ever did, and he said, well, why don't you come up to Boston and meet Larry Burke? I think he'd like to talk to you. So that's the way that happened.
Mm-hmm. When you started at Berklee, how large a school was it?
Well, we had about 140 students. And I noticed 100 of them were milling around wondering what to do. There were about 40 of them really getting taken care of by by Herb Pomeroy and those people. And then these other people who weren't quite so good. I figured, well, this is the area I need to address. And the schools, I think, has somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,700 students.
No, wow.
But it's much broader now. There are all kinds of majors there and so forth. In fact, they just recently started getting into a master's program there in the last 2 years.
Didn't you perform with Teo Macero? Is that how you pronounce his name?
Teo.
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 Yeah, didn't he write a piece that you performed on also?
Yeah, that was in 1957. The piece was called, curiously enough, Fusion.
Yeah.
And it's the first use of that word musically that I'm conscious of. And it was a combination of a jazz quintet, and Art Farmer was in it, myself, and symphony orchestra. And it was played by, we performed it with the New York Philharmonic with Leonard Bernstein. So it was really well received. It's a shame it was never recorded.
Never recorded. That's too bad.
So we played it for a whole week.
Yeah.
So that was a great experience.
I read a quote that was attributed to you, and I wondered if it was correct. Something you said to a student about technique.
You're talking about Bill Crow's
Yes.
book, yeah.
What was it you said?
I said, the good thing about you is your technique. The bad thing about you is your technique. Something along those lines.
Right.
I never realized I'd said it until after.
Right.
I got quoted by students who said, you remember what you told me back in camp, at such and such?
Right.
And I said, oh boy, here I go again.
I guess that, too much technique can be dangerous if you don't know exactly what to do with it.
Well, if that's the thing, the ultimate priority.
Right.
Because technique is only a bottom rung of the ladder.
Yeah.
Music's much more than its functional parts.
Yeah. Tell me about your composing and arranging over the years. You've written some stage band material. You've got books out.
Well, originally I was writing and got calls to write for I wrote for the Artie Shaw. It was called $1 Million Band, and that was quite an experience because I didn't write the way the musicians were used to hearing it, and it wasn't like Basie where everybody played together, had individual parts. One piece was called The Growth of an Idea, and there were 7 different lines, so everybody in the band had to play, and unfortunately in big bands, there's always a bunch of dead wood in it, and I knew instantly the problems that band had, but they were in a furor about it, see, and it was quite traumatic for me.
Oh dear.
So in self-defense, I wound up, because of the rejects over a period of time, developing a experimental band in New York, and I had that, we used to rehearse weekly for and played 2 or 3 different concerts, that's all in that time, for about 5 or 6 years. But it was mainly for me to find out. And I did find out that they were partially right, that I was, I had to restructure the way I wrote, strengthen lines and things of that nature. I didn't change essentially the direction of it, but I learned how to cope with it better, realistically, in terms of what people could do.
And you've written some books.
And then I got into writing for jazz education. Art Dedrick, who was the founder of Kendor Music in New York, sounded me about it. He was, I think, the first one to start publishing for it. He was an arranger for one of the radio stations in Buffalo. Yeah. And he sounded me about it, and I got involved with that. And then later on, I was doing some for Marshall Brown, and then for Berklee a great deal once I went there. And in fact, I was working on a major work when I went there, and the 22-volume work developing the school jazz band. And, for 8 brass, 5 saxes, and rhythm section, and also some alternate instruments, clarinet, flute, French horn. I think tuba too, and a conductor. So that was a 5-year project.
Right. That sounds like a big project.
Oh, it was. Yeah. I had to forgo the writing that I was doing, pretty much to get it done. Yeah.
And you've been honored as a professor emeritus. Emeritus, thank you.
Well, that's kind of sort of when you're retiring. They put you on the shelf, But it's good for, I just wrote a reference letter for a friend of mine that wants to get a teaching job down here. And I
you
use
look
it
down there at the bottom.
But otherwise...
It gives it some weight. Yeah. What is your playing schedule like nowadays?
Well, I've been busier the last 2 months than I have been as a player, than I have been in years, really. And I'm having a ball. I really love it. And I'm not doing a lot of writing, but I still write some, mostly, unless I had commissions to write. I wouldn't get into it seriously, but I always write. Every week I usually write something. I have a quartet that I've been working on down here, and I write for it mainly. And I'm working on doing some standard tunes, which these people down here will relate to, but I'm having kind of a variable time signature thing where the rhythm section will be playing in 12/8 and we're playing in 4. Sometimes I have them shifting around and things like that. So it's an interesting thing. It keeps me out of trouble.
Well, you have your clarinet there, and I would love to have you play something of your choice.
Play Woody Herman's theme song?
That would be wonderful. Bravo. Beautiful vibrato.
Oh, that's from Sidney Bechet.
Now, you were part of which herd?
Well, it depends on when you count. Because I heard Woody had some very good bands, a band that played the blues. I don't think they counted from there.
They didn't count that as a herd?
I think they counted from the band that I was on, 1944 to 46, with Dave Tuff and Flip Phillips. And
right.
Bill Harris, people like that.
Was Chubby Jackson on that particular band? Yeah. It was a swinging group.
Well, there was, it was the first white band, I think, that got into what the black bands were doing. Mm-hmm. And not all of them were doing that, but drummers like Joe Jones, Dave Tuck was playing more along those lines. The best way I can describe it is, prior to that time, the majority of drummers were trying to make it happen. It's almost like putting a ring through your nose, and forcing everybody to play the time, Uh-huh. And there's something to be said for that, and they can get into a good swinging thing. But Dave let the band play, let it happen. It was kind of like a captain that let everybody run the ship, but they knew he was the one that would be in control if things went a little awry.
Yeah. And
I don't know whether that description...
It does, and he...
A great player. There are only a few players that play that way now. That was one of the reasons when Dave would go on a bat that they had difficulty getting somebody to take his place. Initially, many of the people didn't care for Dave's playing because they weren't used to it.
Right.
Once they got used to it, it was just because everybody contributed to the swinging feel this way rather than being. Buddy Rich was a good example. Buddy always controlled the band, although Buddy could play both ways. Because he subbed for Dave one time on a record date, and very few people know it, and he played just like Dave. But with his ego and his capabilities, he had to make sure that the band knew that he was the one that was driving the coach.
Did you ever have occasion to play or be associated with Count Basie or Joe Williams?
No, I didn't. I did with Louis Armstrong. I was involved with the International Youth Band, and Marshall Brown had arranged at Newport for Louis to play a piece with him. I wrote an arrangement of Sunny Side of the Street, I think it was. It was a wonderful thing. I mean, these Europeans were pretty good players and all, and they played about 4 measures of the introduction, and he came in, and the first 3 notes, he just wiped them out. He was so alive, so rich, and so ebullient. It seemed like they were kind of like hadn't gotten out of the shell yet, you know what I mean, by comparison.
Yeah. It's great how jazz has been spread around the world.
Yeah, he was his greatest messenger.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you were able to join us today.
Well, I am too, and this was enjoyable.
And we'll be listening to you later on this afternoon, and you're playing this evening.
No, I'll be playing tomorrow night. I'm playing with the Prez Conference, and then I'll be playing afterward with more of a local group, for the when the people come to meet them, at the reception. Right. Are you coming to that, Phil?
Yes, we will be.
Oh, well, great.
We'll be
I'll see
there.
you there.
All right. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
So on behalf of Hamilton College, I'd like to thank John LaPorta, and we'll be listening.